Today on Destination England is my hometown of Berkeley in Gloucestershire. Home of the Berkeley family of the 12th century. And that family hosted Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, Queen Elizabeth I. And the castle was briefly a royal property. So, if the wealthiest people in England chose to live here, then it's certainly good enough for me. This place seems like so many other tiny rural towns, but it really punches way above its weight. And I'm going to explain some of the reasons why. Just off the old high street, you can walk up a tiny side lane which leads to the Edward Jenner House and Museum. Now, I've lived in Berkeley for many, many years now, and I used to be able to simply walk in and see the small hut where Jenner began experimenting with inoculations. And I am not overcooking the importance of this guy. He really is the father of all immunology. He treated smallpox with derivatives of cowpox, which worked. I mean, how far ahead of your time do you have to be in that league of genius? I think it's just amazing. And that historic giant is simply just a part of Berkeley's importance. Berkeley is so tiny, and these little historic, winding, little single-track lanes lead from the museum, the Jenner Museum, round to the historic St Mary the Virgin Church of Berkeley. And the whole stance of that church is just brilliant, and the little lanes and the fact that they're curved and the antique brickwork always just reminds me of the gravity of the history of Berkeley. Now, the church itself, apart from being an amazing building in its own right, it played a part in the Civil War of around 1645. Now, I actually glossed over the Civil War history of England in my film about Gloucester, where there was a huge parliamentarian base in the cathedral there at Gloucester. But it is a huge part of English history, and we should all know about it. I mean, the church is relevant to that era. So let me give you a little potted history lesson. The English Civil War basically took place in the 1640s, well, 1642 to 1651 to be precise, which I know means little or nothing to anyone in 2025. However, a parliamentarian named Colonel Thomas Rainsborough and his army of men attacked the royalist Berkeley Castle by firing cannons into it from the roof of nearby St Mary's Church. So the church itself is a beautiful building, and the graveyard makes for some interesting reading of historic figures. For example, the King's Jester fell to his death from a balcony in the Berkeley Castle, and he's buried here amongst other notable people. But anyway, the main jewel in the crown of this lovely little town of Berkeley is, of course, its castle. And the castle is, well, one of the last royalist strongholds of England. Incidentally, the parliamentarians wanted basic democracy rather than the rule of a single king or queen, and the royalists, of course, wanted to defend the status quo. So the parliamentarians are often referred to as roundheads, and the royalists are often referred to as cavaliers. I know it seems irrelevant nowadays to most, but its relevance to our history and our country is huge. Anyway, after the castle was attacked and captured in the siege of 1645, a deal was done to prevent it being completely destroyed and completely levelled, providing one of the main keep walls was completely destroyed. The huge defensive keep walls were known as curtain walls, without which, of course, the inhabitants would be vulnerable to attack. In Berkeley Castle's instance, it was attacked from the Welsh, actually. Anyway, the deal was done, and the now destroyed curtain wall cannot be rebuilt as a part of that deal, because that made it defenceless, and they called that a building that had been slighted. That's to say, militarily useless. And along with that proviso, the Berkeley family were allowed to keep the ownership of the castle. The keep wall, or curtain wall as you will, is still visible today and just partly rebuilt to up to about 20 inches in height, just to prevent people all falling into the lower levels and gardens. And yes, the tiny town of Berkeley is infamous nationwide. Most will relate it to Edward II and a hot iron being plunged into his bowels and his death, but there's simply a lot of uncertainty about that. Edward II's wife Isabella and her lover called Roger Mortimer certainly wanted Edward dead, but few realised that he was rescued from his imprisonment at the castle by parliamentarian forces, but was subsequently recaptured on a couple of occasions, I believe. Some even speculate that it was someone else that died in that gruesome death in a dungeon-like place of the castle. But the thing that impresses me most, and I mean even above all that history, is the actual fact that the Berkeley family still live here for one, and that their forefathers literally owned an uninterrupted stretch of land reaching all the way from here at their castle home in Berkeley right the way to Berkeley Square in London, hence the name Berkeley Square in our capital city. And just think about that for a moment, and the wealth that would have been involved in owning such a huge swathe of this country. That is 127 miles and would take almost 3 hours to drive in a modern car. Now think about that in the 16th century. What kind of money's involved to be able to own that much land? Of course, there's much more detail in the history of all this, but this is just a tiny snapshot of my home in town of Berkeley. And as I say, it was good enough for royalty through the ages, and it's certainly good enough for me.